I'm out here in the garden next to one of my many nettle patches, harvesting some nettles for some tea and some soap making. And I thought that I would talk to you about the best ways to harvest herbs and to preserve them, because it's one of those things that's quite easy, but it's also really easy to get wrong and have spoilage. So let me give you some of my top tips learned through many mistakes. One of the most important things to consider when you are harvesting herbs is that you want to be sure you're harvesting them on a nice dry day. If your herbs or your plants are wet, then you are not going to get the best peak production from your plants when you bring them in to preserve them. Water on your plants, even if it's something as simple as morning dew, can potentially increase the risk of spoilage. It also will diminish the nutritional value of your herbs because many of the good elements are washed away or diluted in water. So what you want to be sure is that you're picking things at their peak on a nice, dry, ideally warm day, because that is when the plant is at its best. So on that front, I don't actually even wash any of the herbs that we have picked. Here at Garter, we don't use any herbicides or pesticides, and I make sure that we're picking from places that I know haven't been sprayed. I also pick from places where I know the dogs haven't been, so that I don't have any reason to need to wash. When you wash, particularly flowers, it can potentially wash away things like pollen and other nutritional elements that you want to use in your tinctures, your teas, your cooking, whatever. So just nice dry plants, ideally from a warm day. If you are wanting to use the leaves of a plant, you want to be sure that you pick the plant before it starts to flower. There's a little nettle flower right there. That's because the plant is putting its energy when it flowers into the actual flowers and creating seed. You want to pick the plant when the energy is most in its leaves. So you want to pick it before that plant actually goes to set a flower. Now, of course, that's different if you're actually wanting to use the flowers. Then you want to wait for the flowers to open and then pick them when they are nice and young. What you don't want to do is wait for them to set seed, because then the nutrition and the nutrients are in the actual seeds. So nice young flowers, and then you want to pick off, in this case calendula, the whole head. I live in a very wet climate. I also live very close to a very large bog, which means we have a lot of flies. Both that climate as well as the flies means that I have a lot of potential for spoilage when I'm drying herbs. So many resources will advise laying out herbs to dry or creating bundles, and I find that that is not always the best way. So if I'm harvesting particularly large amounts of herbs, I actually use a dehydrator. I've just bought something very cheaply off of Amazon, and it works really well to dehydrate for the large parts of the year where we're bringing in a lot of plant matter. So maybe that's herbs or flowers or mushrooms, and that sort of summertime where it's damp and the flies are terrible. However, if there are plants, particularly things like calendula or other flowers that you're sort of picking as you go, in which case I will use other methods for drying my plants. I use a lot of IKEA mesh baskets to dry things, particularly this time of year where it's sort of late spring, the flies aren't quite out yet. There might be even the radiators on or a fire going, and those kind of things help dry it out safely, so I know there won't be spoilage. So another way to dry herbs is to dry them in bunches, and that is a really good way to preserve things. This is what we do with a lot of big stalks of nettles, things like bog myrtle, and other sort of herbs for the kitchen. But one of my tips with this is that you want to be sure you're only gathering quite small bunches, maybe 3, 4, 5 different stems bunched together, because every place that your stems touch is the potential for wetness and moisture and contamination to develop. So a few small bunches is a lot better than one big bunch, allowing your herbs to really dry out thoroughly. So even if you're going to use your herbs relatively fresh to preserve in something like oil for making a salve, you still want to partially dry your herbs, either using the bundle or sort of laying it out to wilt for, overnight, 24 hours or so. Because what's happening is the water is coming off your herbs and it will reduce the chance of your oil spoiling. So how do you know your herbs are ready to store? You will go through the process of your herbs being nice and fresh to wilted. This sort of stage, these have been left for a few days. This would be really ideal if I wanted to store it in oil and infuse some herbs in oil. You want a little bit of the moisture gone, but this isn't anything that will keep for a long time just on its own. But really, if you're wanting to store them dry, you're looking for herbs that are completely dry and crumbly to the touch. These have been dried for a few weeks and they are completely dry. When I want to store them, I simply just put them in a nice clean jar with a nice tight lid. You want to label it, and you want to be sure that you're using your herbs within about a year after they've been dried. If they ever smell bad or musty or develop any mold, then you don't want to use any of those herbs. So there's no hard or fast rules when it comes to infusing herbs in oil or actually vinegar. There are a couple of tips though. So number one is that you don't want to use the freshest of the fresh flowers, and that's because they contain a lot of water and that can make your oil go rancid. So ideally you're looking for things that have wilted and have been dried for a few days or are completely dry. Then you simply put the amount of plant matter that you have in your container. A nice clean jar is what I'm using here. And then you're going to fill it with oil. Now, you want to ensure that the oil fully covers your plants and that you've got a nice bit of gap between the plant matter and the top of the oil. You want to give that a little bit of a stir. Just make sure that there's plenty of space in it. The reason that there's no hard and fast rule is, of course, because different plants take up different amounts of space, have different densities, all of that. This is really just a good guide to infusing your herbs. Once you have your herbs in your oil, you're either going to want to weigh the top of the herbs down with something like a fermentation weight or seal it off and let it infuse for about a month. You don't want to infuse anything in direct sunlight. You want it somewhere bright, but not just directly in the sun. And in the case of this calendula in this sweet almond oil, it will slowly turn bright yellow. After you have infused your herbs for your allotted time, you're then going to want to strain out the plant matter. And keep the oil in a nice clean jar, and then the oil will keep for about 6 months to a year in a nice, cool, dark place.